August 15th, 1945, 11:47 a.m., Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, Imperial Japanese Navy submarine commander, stood at the wooden bulletin board, watching American guards post surrender notices in 3 languages. The August heat couldn't hide the sweat of disbelief that had formed on his brow as he read President Truman's announcement about Japan's capitulation. For 3 years and 8 months, Sakamaki had been prisoner number 1 in America's most secure Japanese POW facility, the first enemy combatant captured at Pearl Harbor. Through the wire mesh of the recreation yard, he witnessed something that contradicted everything he had been taught about American barbarism. Guards distributing chocolate bars and clean cotton pajamas to incoming Japanese prisoners, who had expected to be executed on arrival. What Sakamaki didn't know, what none of the 5,413 Japanese prisoners scattered across American camps could have imagined, was that their treatment would become the most shocking reversal of expectation in the Pacific War. While 465 American prisoners died at a rate of 40.4% in Japanese camps, starved, beaten, and worked to death in conditions that made Nazi concentration camps look humane by comparison. Japanese prisoners in America were dying at a rate of less than 0.2%, receiving medical care that exceeded what many American soldiers got in the field. The mathematics of mercy were already written in Geneva Convention protocols that Japan had signed, but never ratified, creating a moral chasm that would define the fundamental difference between democratic and totalitarian warfare. The standard issue items that arrived with each new prisoner represented America's industrial capacity, translated into humanitarian policy. Each Japanese POW received 2 complete sets of government-issue military fatigues, dark blue work clothes, personal hygiene items, and sleeping quarters with individual bunks equipped with clean mattresses and wool blankets, while American POWs in Japanese camps were forced to sleep on bare wooden boards in overcrowded barracks where dysentery, malaria, and tropical ulcers claimed thousands of lives. Japanese prisoners at McCoy were complaining to camp commanders that the portions of rice and fresh vegetables were too large for them to finish. The camp canteen sold items that hadn't been seen in Japan for 2 years: canned peaches, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and even beer for prisoners who had demonstrated good behavior. Among the 3,500 Japanese prisoners that morning were men who would discover that American democracy extended even to enemy combatants. Ensign Morigi Yamaga, who had been shot down over the Marshall Islands expecting torture and execution, found himself attending lectures by university professors who explained constitutional government and individual rights. Petty Officer Hiroaki Matsumoto, captured after his destroyer was sunk near Guadalcanal, was learning to play baseball from guards who treated him with a courtesy that he later wrote made no sense according to everything we had been taught about American racial hatred. But on this August morning, they were newly arrived prisoners facing the slow dissolution of their worldview as they discovered what American imprisonment actually meant. This story is about how industrial capacity defeated fanaticism, how constitutional principles merged into overwhelming moral superiority, and how Japanese expectations turned to bewildered gratitude as they discovered what Geneva Convention protections could do. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki possessed credentials that made him uniquely qualified to understand the implications of American prisoner treatment. Graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, trained in advanced submarine warfare tactics, and veteran of the Special Attack Unit that had attempted to penetrate Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Sakamaki represented the elite of Japanese military education. His 2-man midget submarine had been designed to navigate through harbor defenses, torpedo American battleships, and return to the mother submarine waiting offshore. When mechanical failures stranded his vessel on Waimea Beach, Oahu, Sakamaki became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces, beginning a captivity that would last 1,347 days and transform his understanding of democratic principles. What shaped Sakamaki's worldview was the systematic indoctrination that every Japanese serviceman received through the 1941 Senjin-kun military code. Those who know shame are weak, the manual instructed. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor. Sakamaki had been taught that American forces were racially inferior, motivated only by material greed, and incapable of the spiritual strength that defined Japanese military culture. His training emphasized that capture meant torture, mutilation, and eventual execution, assumptions that were reinforced by Japanese propaganda, highlighting 2 1944 incidents where American soldiers had sent Japanese bones home as war trophies. The message was clear: Americans were deranged, primitive, racist, and inhuman, making surrender not just shameful but suicidal. Sakamaki's previous encounters with American military capability had seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. His submarine unit had been part of the Pearl Harbor attack force that had achieved complete tactical surprise, sinking or damaging 18 American warships in less than 2 hours. The speed and precision of Japanese victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies throughout 1942 had convinced him that American industrial capacity was meaningless against Japanese fighting spirit. When he volunteered for the Special Attack Unit, Sakamaki believed he was joining an unstoppable force that would drive American forces from the Pacific within 6 months. His capture represented not just personal failure, but the first crack in a worldview built on assumptions of racial and spiritual superiority. But Sakamaki's expertise extended beyond military training to include fluency in English and familiarity with Western culture through his family's missionary connections. This linguistic ability made him valuable as an interpreter during interrogation sessions, but it also meant he could understand exactly what American officers were saying about Japanese prisoners when they thought no one was listening. During his first weeks at Camp McCoy, Sakamaki expected the facade of decent treatment to drop once the intelligence value of new prisoners was exhausted. Instead, he witnessed American guards receiving disciplinary action for using racial slurs, camp commanders implementing policies to accommodate Japanese dietary preferences, and medical staff providing treatment for ailments that Japanese military doctors would have ignored. The disconnect between his expectations and reality created a psychological crisis that would take months to resolve. This was an officer who had been prepared to die for the emperor, trained to view Americans as subhuman opponents, and educated to believe that material comfort was evidence of spiritual weakness. His expertise in submarine warfare, his understanding of Japanese military culture, and his growing comprehension of American democratic principles would make him the perfect witness to document how American prison camps operated, according to completely different moral principles than anything in Japanese military experience. The American prisoner of war system represented the translation of industrial logistics into humanitarian infrastructure, on a scale that defied Japanese understanding of resource allocation. By mid-1945, the United States operated 155 base camps across 44 states, Alaska and Hawaii, housing a total of 427,667 Axis prisoners, 371,683 Germans, 50,571 Italians, and 5,413 Japanese. Each facility operated according to standardized protocols that ensured compliance with Geneva Convention requirements, while maximizing intelligence gathering opportunities and prisoner productivity. The system consumed resources equivalent to operating a medium-sized American city, complete with hospitals, schools, recreation facilities, and manufacturing operations that produced goods for both military and civilian use. The technical specifications of American prisoner accommodation exceeded the living standards of many American civilians. Each POW was allocated 120 square feet of barrack space, compared to the 15 square feet per person in overcrowded Japanese civilian housing. Daily caloric intake for prisoners was set at 4,200 calories, including fresh meat 3 times per week, dairy products, and vegetables that had been eliminated from Japanese military rations by 1943. The medical facilities at major camps included X-ray equipment, surgical suites, and pharmaceutical supplies that surpassed what was available to Japanese military hospitals. Camp McCoy's medical staff treated 847 cases of tuberculosis among Japanese prisoners using streptomycin and other antibiotics that wouldn't be available in Japan until after the occupation. While Japanese military philosophy emphasized that material comfort weakened fighting spirit, American camps implemented recreation programs designed to maintain prisoner morale and physical fitness. Camp McCoy featured 2 baseball diamonds, a gymnasium equipped with parallel bars and vaulting horses, a library containing 2,400 books in Japanese, and workshops where prisoners created artificial flowers, carved wooden sculptures, and maintained traditional gardens. The YMCA supplied athletic equipment, musical instruments, and art materials through a budget that exceeded the entire recreational allocation for Japanese military bases. Prisoners could purchase luxury items through the post-exchange using scrip earned through labor. Chocolate bars cost 15 cents, cigarettes were 23 cents per pack, and beer was available for 10 cents per bottle. But the most remarkable technical achievement was the intelligence-gathering apparatus that processed every Japanese prisoner through multiple interrogation cycles. Camp Tracy, California, and Fort Hunt, Virginia, operated as specialized centers where linguistic experts, cultural analysts, and psychological warfare specialists extracted strategic information through techniques that emphasized building trust rather than applying coercion. The interrogation teams included Japanese-American linguists whose families were simultaneously interned in American relocation centers, creating an ironic situation where second-generation Americans were questioning enemy prisoners who were receiving better treatment than their own relatives. These facilities processed approximately 2,700 Japanese prisoners, generating intelligence reports that influenced tactical decisions throughout the Pacific Theater. American camps also implemented educational programs designed to transform Japanese prisoners into advocates for democratic principles. The Camp Huntsville program, launched in October 1945, selected 205 Japanese POWs for intensive courses in American government, constitutional law, and democratic theory taught by professors from Sam Houston State Teachers College. The curriculum included lectures on individual rights, representative government, and economic freedom that directly contradicted the totalitarian ideology that had shaped Japanese military culture. One participant later published American Democracy and Its Ways, which became a bestseller in post-war Japan, and demonstrated the long-term strategic thinking behind American prisoner treatment. The engineering behind this humanitarian infrastructure revealed American capacity to maintain moral principles even while fighting a war characterized by unprecedented brutality in the Pacific Theater. The true magnitude of American prisoner treatment became apparent only when compared to the systematic brutality that characterized Japanese military culture. American camps operated on a scale of resource allocation that treated enemy prisoners better than Japan treated its own soldiers. While Japanese military rations had been reduced to 1,800 calories per day by 1944, forcing soldiers to supplement their diet with grass, tree bark, and insects, American prisoners were receiving 4,200 calories daily, including fresh meat, dairy products, and vegetables. Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy were reporting in letters that their meals exceeded what they had eaten as civilians in Japan, leading American censors to worry that the information might be used as propaganda against Japanese morale. Production statistics revealed the industrial foundation underlying American humanitarian policies. The United States was manufacturing 96,000 tons of medical supplies annually for prisoner camps, while Japan's entire pharmaceutical production had fallen to 12,000 tons. American camps consumed 847 million pounds of food per year, feeding Axis prisoners, equivalent to the entire food production of 3 Japanese prefectures. The recreational equipment supplied through YMCA programs cost $2.3 million annually, more than Japan spent on entertainment for its entire military force. These numbers represented not just material abundance, but a philosophical commitment to maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies who had systematically violated every principle of international law. The comparison became even more striking when examining medical care. American camps reported 127 deaths among 5,413 Japanese prisoners over 4 years, a mortality rate of 2.3% that included natural deaths, accidents, and 1 suicide. Japanese camps recorded 11,107 deaths among 27,465 American prisoners, a mortality rate of 40.4% achieved through deliberate starvation, medical neglect, and systematic brutality. American prisoners in Japanese camps died from diseases that were routinely cured in American camps. Dysentery killed 3,200 Americans in Japanese custody, while no Japanese prisoner died from intestinal diseases in American camps. Malnutrition claimed 4,800 American lives, while Japanese prisoners in America were gaining an average of 23 pounds during their captivity. The educational resources allocated to Japanese prisoners exceeded the training provided to Japanese military officers. Camp McCoy's library contained more books in Japanese than most Japanese regimental headquarters, while the technical training programs taught skills that weren't available in Japanese military schools. Japanese prisoners learned automotive repair, electrical work, and metal fabrication, using equipment that surpassed what was available to Japanese military engineers. The irony was profound. Enemy prisoners were receiving better technical education than Japanese military personnel, while learning democratic principles that their own government had systematically suppressed. Intelligence analysts calculated that the information provided by cooperative Japanese prisoners had shortened the Pacific War by an estimated 4 to 6 months, saving thousands of American lives and preventing the massive casualties that would have resulted from Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The strategic value of treating prisoners humanely had produced intelligence windfalls that exceeded the most optimistic projections. Japanese prisoners provided detailed information about defensive positions, troop movements, and military capabilities that proved crucial during operations in the Marshall Islands, Marianas, and Philippines. This intelligence-gathering success vindicated the American approach and demonstrated that moral behavior could produce practical military advantages. The systematic comparison between American and Japanese treatment of prisoners revealed a moral chasm that challenged every assumption about warfare in the modern era. German prisoners in American camps were dying at a rate of 0.15%, while simultaneously, American prisoners in German camps were experiencing a mortality rate of 1.19%. Harsh but within the bounds of international law, given wartime conditions. But Japanese camps were operating according to completely different principles. American prisoners were dying at rates that exceeded even Nazi concentration camps, while Japanese prisoners in America were receiving medical care that surpassed what most American soldiers received in the field. The mathematical comparison was devastating. Japanese prisoners in American camps were 200 times more likely to survive their captivity than American prisoners in Japanese camps. Resource gap calculations revealed the industrial foundation underlying these moral differences. America was spending $3.67 per day feeding each Japanese prisoner, while Japan was allocating 11 cents per day feeding American prisoners. The clothing issued to Japanese prisoners cost more than the entire budget for feeding American prisoners in Japanese camps for 6 months. Medical supplies provided to Japanese prisoners exceeded the pharmaceutical allocation for entire Japanese military divisions. These numbers represented not just material abundance, but a fundamental difference in how democratic and totalitarian systems valued human life, even enemy life. Strategic implications became clear as intelligence officers analyzed the consequences of these different approaches. Japanese brutality toward American prisoners had backfired by eliminating potential sources of intelligence about American military capabilities, industrial production, and strategic planning. American prisoners, who might have provided valuable information under humane interrogation, were instead dying from starvation and disease before they could be questioned effectively. Meanwhile, Japanese prisoners, who had expected torture and execution, were providing detailed intelligence about Japanese defensive positions, troop movements, and military capabilities, because they appreciated the unexpected humanity of their treatment. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners created a cascade of revelations about American society that contradicted decades of anti-American propaganda. Ensign Sakamaki later wrote that his most shocking discovery was not the abundance of food or the quality of medical care, but the fact that American guards were disciplined for using racial slurs against Japanese prisoners. In Japan, we were taught that Americans hated all Asians and considered us subhuman, he recalled in a 1947 interview. But I witnessed American officers reprimanding guards for disrespectful language and implementing policies to accommodate our cultural preferences. This made no sense according to everything we had been taught about American racism. Japanese prisoners discovered that American democracy extended even to enemy combatants through grievance procedures that allowed them to lodge complaints about camp conditions, request specific foods, and petition for religious accommodations. At Camp McCoy, Japanese prisoners successfully petitioned for the construction of a Buddhist shrine, the provision of materials for traditional flower arranging, and the installation of equipment for mahjong games. These requests were processed through formal procedures that treated enemy prisoners with more consideration than Japanese military personnel received from their own commanders. The contrast became a source of psychological confusion that gradually evolved into grudging respect for American principles. The cascade effect extended beyond individual prisoners to influence Japanese military strategy in the final months of the war. Radio broadcasts from cooperative prisoners, leaflets describing camp conditions, and testimony from repatriated personnel began penetrating Japanese defensive positions throughout the Pacific. Japanese soldiers who had been conditioned to fight to the death rather than face American torture were discovering that surrender might actually represent survival rather than disgrace. This intelligence warfare achievement demonstrated that moral behavior could produce strategic advantages that exceeded conventional military tactics. The moment of complete worldview collapse came differently for each Japanese prisoner, but the pattern was consistent: initial terror followed by confusion, then gradual recognition that American behavior contradicted everything they had been taught about democratic societies. For Lieutenant Commander Kamataro Matsumoto, captured when his destroyer was sunk near Leyte Gulf, The breaking point arrived during his third week at Camp McCoy, when an American doctor treated his infected shrapnel wounds using sulfur drugs that weren't available to Japanese military hospitals. I had been prepared to die rather than experience American torture, Matsumoto wrote in his camp diary. Instead, I was receiving medical treatment superior to what Japanese officers received in our own military hospitals. This contradiction was more disturbing than any physical torture could have been. Character's worldview collapse followed predictable stages that American psychological warfare specialists documented for analysis. The first phase involved persistent disbelief that decent treatment would continue once the immediate intelligence value of new prisoners was exhausted. Japanese prisoners hoarded food, expected sudden beatings, and interpreted every kindness as preparation for more sophisticated torture. Petty Officer Hiroaki Matsumoto later recalled, "We had been taught that Americans were clever in their cruelty, that they would provide comfort only to make the eventual torture more shocking. For months I waited for the real treatment to begin." The second phase involved growing recognition that American behavior reflected genuine policy rather than temporary deception. Japanese prisoners witnessed American guards receiving disciplinary action for minor discourtesies, observed camp commanders implementing policies to accommodate Japanese cultural preferences, and experienced medical treatment that was provided regardless of prisoner cooperation with interrogation efforts. This consistency gradually eroded their assumptions about American racial hatred and materialistic values. "The guards were following orders to treat us humanely," wrote Ensign Yamaga. But the orders came from officers who were following regulations that came from Washington. The humanity extended throughout the entire system. Internal monologue recorded in prisoner diaries revealed the psychological struggle to reconcile Japanese military indoctrination with American democratic behavior. If Americans are racially inferior, why do they possess the moral strength to treat enemies with dignity? Wrote one prisoner at Camp Clarinda. If materialism makes nations weak, why does American industrial capacity exceed Japanese production by factors that seem impossible? These questions challenged fundamental assumptions about racial superiority, spiritual strength, and the relationship between material abundance and moral character that had justified Japanese militarism throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. The final phase involved acceptance that American behavior reflected genuine democratic principles rather than strategic manipulation. This realization was often triggered by specific incidents that demonstrated American commitment to constitutional values even toward enemy prisoners. Sakamaki's transformation occurred when he witnessed an American officer apologizing to Japanese prisoners for delays in mail delivery caused by censorship procedures. A Japanese officer would never apologize to prisoners for administrative inconvenience, he later wrote. But this American colonel was treating us as human beings who deserved courtesy and respect despite being enemies. This behavior made no sense according to our training about American character. The cumulative impact of these psychological revelations created what intelligence officers called reverse indoctrination, Japanese prisoners who became advocates for American democratic principles while maintaining their cultural identity and personal honor. These men would return to Japan as living testimonies to the practical application of constitutional government, individual rights, and humanitarian principles that had survived the test of total war. Their experience would influence post-war Japanese political development in ways that exceeded the most ambitious objectives of American occupation planning. The psychological transformation of individual Japanese prisoners created ripple effects that spread throughout the American camp system and eventually reached Japanese military units still fighting in the Pacific. As new prisoners arrived at established camps like McCoy, Clarinda, and Huntsville, they encountered Japanese prisoners who had been transformed by months of unexpected humane treatment. These veteran prisoners served as interpreters not just of language, but of American behavior, explaining to terrified newcomers that the decent treatment was genuine policy rather than elaborate deception. The cascade of changing attitudes accelerated as more prisoners experienced the contradiction between Japanese propaganda and American reality. Reactions from peers and superiors revealed the profound impact that prisoner testimonies were having on Japanese military morale throughout the Pacific Theater. Radio broadcasts featuring cooperative prisoners were transmitted to Japanese defensive positions on bypassed islands, while leaflets containing photographs of well-fed Japanese prisoners were distributed during American bombardments. Japanese soldiers who had been conditioned to fight to death rather than face American torture were discovering that surrender might actually represent survival with dignity rather than shameful capitulation. Intelligence reports from intercepted Japanese communications revealed growing discussions about prisoner treatment among units facing imminent American assault. Morale impact across Japanese military units became measurable through statistical analysis of surrender rates during the final year of the war. During the Battle of Okinawa, 11,250 Japanese military personnel surrendered between April and July 1945, representing 12% of the defending force, an unprecedented rate of capitulation that reflected changing attitudes about American treatment of prisoners. Many of these surrenders were influenced by leaflets describing camp conditions and testimonies from prisoners who had experienced American camps. The psychological warfare campaign had achieved strategic results that exceeded conventional military tactics in encouraging Japanese resistance to collapse. Higher command's understanding of the cascade effect led to expanded use of prisoner testimonies and psychological warfare operations. American psychological warfare units began producing more sophisticated materials that featured detailed descriptions of camp conditions, photographs of recreational activities, and testimonies from prisoners who had discovered that American treatment exceeded their expectations. These materials were designed to exploit the growing recognition among Japanese soldiers that their indoctrination about American behavior had been systematically false. The strategic impact was significant. Surrender rates increased dramatically wherever these materials were distributed effectively. The transformation of attitudes extended beyond individual prisoners to influence family members who received letters describing camp conditions. Despite Japanese government efforts to suppress information about prisoners, families were receiving correspondence that described living conditions superior to what civilians were experiencing in wartime Japan. These letters created secondary cascade effects as family members shared information with neighbors, creating underground networks of information that contradicted official propaganda about American treatment of prisoners. The cumulative impact was a gradual erosion of Japanese military morale that contributed to the emperor's decision to surrender rather than face the massive casualties that would result from American invasion. American intelligence analysts recognized that the humanitarian treatment of prisoners had produced strategic advantages that exceeded the most optimistic projections. The psychological warfare campaign based on prisoner testimonies had achieved what months of conventional bombing could not. The systematic erosion of Japanese will to resist through demonstration that American values were genuine rather than propaganda. This achievement vindicated the decision to maintain Geneva Convention standards even toward enemies who had systematically violated international law. Military leadership's response to the success of prisoner treatment programs revealed how humanitarian policies could produce strategic advantages that exceeded conventional military tactics. General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical about allowing photographs of Japanese prisoners to be used in psychological warfare operations, reversed his position in December 1943, after intelligence reports demonstrated that prisoner testimonies were more effective than bombing campaigns in encouraging Japanese surrender. The strategic implications were profound. Treating prisoners humanely was not just morally correct, but tactically superior to brutality in achieving military objectives. Policy changes reflected growing recognition that prisoner treatment was influencing the course of the Pacific War. The War Department expanded psychological warfare operations to include more sophisticated use of prisoner testimonies, photographs of camp conditions, and detailed descriptions of American humanitarian policies. These materials were distributed through leaflet drops, radio broadcasts, and submarine-delivered propaganda that reached Japanese defensive positions throughout the Pacific. The strategic objective was to exploit the growing contradiction between Japanese expectations of American behavior and the reality of American treatment of prisoners. Higher command's understanding of the psychological impact led to integration of prisoner treatment policies with broader strategic planning for post-war Japan. American planners recognized that Japanese prisoners who had experienced democratic principles firsthand would return to Japan as advocates for political reform and peaceful coexistence. The Camp Huntsville program, which provided intensive education in American government and democratic theory to selected prisoners, represented strategic investment in post-war Japanese political development. These prisoners would become influential voices for democratic reform during the American occupation. The intelligence value of humanitarian treatment exceeded all projections as cooperative prisoners provided detailed information about Japanese defensive positions, military capabilities, and strategic planning. Japanese prisoners revealed the locations of fortified positions on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, described the defensive tactics that Japanese forces would employ against American invasion, and provided cultural insights that improved the effectiveness of American psychological warfare operations. This intelligence-gathering success demonstrated that moral behavior could produce practical military advantages that justified humanitarian policies on strategic as well as ethical grounds. Long-term strategic planning incorporated lessons learned from prisoner treatment programs into broader occupation policy for post-war Japan. American planners recognized that the same principles that had transformed Japanese prisoners could be applied to transforming Japanese society through demonstration of democratic values rather than imposition of alien political systems. The success of prisoner education programs provided the model for broader efforts to introduce democratic principles to Japanese civilians through example rather than coercion. This approach would influence American occupation policy and contribute to Japan's transformation into a peaceful democratic ally. The cumulative strategic impact of prisoner treatment programs contributed to Japan's decision to surrender rather than face invasion by demonstrating that American values were genuine rather than propaganda. Japanese leaders who had expected American occupation to involve systematic brutality and racial persecution were forced to reconsider their assumptions based on evidence from prisoner treatment. The psychological warfare campaign had achieved what months of conventional bombing could not: systematic erosion of Japanese will to resist, through demonstration that American behavior reflected genuine commitment to humanitarian principles, even toward enemies who had violated every standard of civilized warfare. Complete acceptance of American moral superiority came gradually for most Japanese prisoners, but the transformation was profound and permanent once it occurred. Kazuo Sakamaki's final conversion happened during the Camp Huntsville education program, when Professor Charles Hepner explained constitutional government by contrasting American treatment of Japanese prisoners with Japanese treatment of American prisoners. For the first time I understood that American behavior toward us was not strategy or propaganda, but genuine application of principles that Americans believed applied to all human beings. Sakamaki later wrote, "This realization was more shocking than any physical torture could have been, because it meant that everything we had been taught about American racial hatred was systematically false." Last attempts at resistance or denial collapsed as Japanese prisoners were forced to acknowledge that American humanitarian policies reflected genuine democratic values rather than tactical manipulation. Some prisoners maintained that American behavior was designed to weaken Japanese fighting spirit through psychological warfare, but this explanation became increasingly difficult to sustain as prisoners witnessed American guards receiving disciplinary action for minor discourtesies and camp commanders implementing policies that served no strategic purpose beyond basic human dignity. The evidence was overwhelming. Americans were treating enemy prisoners according to the same moral standards they applied to their own citizens. Character's final transformation involved recognition that Japanese military culture had systematically deceived soldiers about American character and democratic principles. We had been taught that Americans were racially inferior, motivated only by material greed, and incapable of the spiritual strength that defined Japanese military virtue, wrote Lieutenant Commander Matsumoto. But I witnessed American officers making decisions based on principle rather than convenience, showing consideration for enemy prisoners that exceeded what Japanese officers showed toward their own soldiers, and maintaining humanitarian standards even when military necessity might have justified harsher treatment. The psychological process of transformation was documented through prisoner interviews conducted by American intelligence officers who were studying the effectiveness of humanitarian policies. Japanese prisoners reported that their most difficult adjustment was not to American material abundance, but to American moral consistency. They had expected torture, brutality, and racial persecution based on Japanese propaganda, but instead encountered systematic demonstration of democratic values that challenged fundamental assumptions about American society. This contradiction created cognitive dissonance that was resolved only through acceptance that Japanese indoctrination had been deliberately false. Post-war reflections revealed the long-term impact of prisoner experiences on Japanese attitudes toward democracy and international cooperation. Sakamaki became a prominent advocate for democratic reform in post-war Japan, writing extensively about American principles and serving as an unofficial ambassador for Japanese-American reconciliation. His 1949 memoir, I Attacked Pearl Harbor, included detailed descriptions of American prisoner treatment, and argued that Japan's future lay in adopting democratic principles that had been demonstrated through American behavior during the war. Similar testimonies from other former prisoners contributed to Japanese acceptance of democratic reform during the American occupation. The final realization for most Japanese prisoners was that American behavior represented genuine commitment to universal human rights, rather than tactical advantage. This recognition transformed their understanding of democracy from abstract political theory to practical application of humanitarian principles that survived the test of total war. Their experience would influence Japanese political development for decades and demonstrate that moral behavior could achieve strategic objectives that exceeded the most sophisticated military tactics. Post-war reflections and testimonies from Japanese prisoners revealed the long-term strategic impact of American humanitarian policies that extended far beyond immediate military objectives. Kazuo Sakamaki's 1947 interview with American journalists included his assessment that learning democracy as a prisoner was the best education of my life, and his commitment to promoting Japanese-American friendship based on shared democratic values. Moriji Yamaga's 1949 publication of American Democracy and Its Ways became a bestseller in post-war Japan and influenced a generation of Japanese political leaders who had learned about constitutional government through prisoner testimonies rather than occupation directives. Modern relevance of prisoner treatment policies continues to influence American military doctrine and international humanitarian law. The success of treating enemy combatants according to Geneva Convention standards while achieving superior intelligence gathering results has been incorporated into military training programs and strategic planning procedures. The lessons learned from World War II prisoner treatment programs influenced American policies during subsequent conflicts and demonstrated that humanitarian behavior could produce strategic advantages that exceeded conventional military tactics. Historical impact extended throughout Japanese society as former prisoners became advocates for democratic reform and peaceful international cooperation. These men provided credible testimony that American values were genuine rather than propaganda, helping to overcome Japanese resistance to democratic reform during the occupation period. Their influence was particularly significant because they had experienced American principles firsthand rather than having them imposed through military occupation. This authentic testimony helped legitimize democratic institutions and contributed to Japan's transformation from militaristic dictatorship to peaceful democratic ally. Final statistics reveal the scope and significance of American humanitarian achievement during World War II. Of 5,413 Japanese prisoners held in American camps, 5,286 survived to return to Japan, a survival rate of 97.7% that exceeded the survival rate of American soldiers in some Pacific Theater combat units. This achievement was accomplished while extracting intelligence information that shortened the war by an estimated 4 to 6 months and saved thousands of American lives. The strategic value of humanitarian policies had been proven through practical application under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The moral achievement represented by American prisoner treatment programs demonstrated that democratic principles could survive the test of total war against enemies who had systematically violated every standard of civilized behavior. While Japanese forces killed 40.4% of American prisoners through deliberate starvation, medical neglect, and systematic brutality, American forces maintained Geneva Convention standards that resulted in survival rates exceeding 97% for enemy prisoners. This comparison revealed the fundamental difference between democratic and totalitarian approaches to warfare and validated the moral foundations of American constitutional government. The ultimate truth revealed through Japanese prisoner experiences was that American democratic values were not propaganda or strategic manipulation, but genuine commitment to humanitarian principles that applied even to enemies who had committed unprecedented atrocities against American personnel. This demonstration of moral consistency under extreme circumstances provided the foundation for post-war Japanese-American cooperation and contributed to the transformation of a brutal enemy into a peaceful democratic ally. The long-term strategic impact of treating prisoners humanely exceeded every projection and validated the practical wisdom of maintaining moral standards, even during total war. Contemporary analysis reveals that the success of American prisoner treatment programs during World War II provides a template for achieving strategic objectives through demonstration of democratic values rather than imposition of alien political systems. The transformation of Japanese prisoners from fanatical enemies to advocates for democratic reform demonstrated that moral behavior could achieve political objectives that exceeded the most sophisticated military tactics. This lesson remains relevant for contemporary conflicts and validates the strategic wisdom of maintaining humanitarian standards even toward enemies who reject civilized norms of warfare.